So it seems that the parliamentary elections in Armenia that were scheduled initially for the 9th of December 2023 will in all likelihood now take place on the 20th of June this year. This wasn't really a big surprise, but there were differences of opinion. Nobody knew whether there would be snap elections or not. So it seems to me that the date is now more or less fixed. And the question now, of course, is what does this mean for the government, which has an overwhelming majority in parliament now? What does it also mean to the business magnate Gagik Tsarukyan, the Homeland Salvation Movement, and the country in general? Now, a poll that was conducted by the International Republican Institute, the IRI, recently suggested that in this election, Nikol Pashinyan's party, in other words, the Prime Minister's party, would garner a very large percentage of the votes, and that all the other parties, particularly the two in parliament, would get very small representations, and the other aggregate parties that have been demonstrating will really not manage to get many votes. Now, it's early days. It's early days because you never know what could happen between March and June. You never know what political surprises or what political shocks might take place between now and then that could easily alter the results, because results in elections are very fluid and they are often impacted by events that take place not 6 months earlier, but 6 days earlier. So there is a lot to be said there. And this idea that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan would pretty much romp in again with the largest number of seats is quite a sensible conclusion at this stage. However, it also depends on whether there will be a third force that could come up, that could come together, that could crystallize, which would then siphon votes off from everybody else. And at that stage, it would no longer be a one-party system that rules Armenia, but a coalition. And personally, I think that at this stage in the history of Armenia, a coalition is not such a bad prospect, assuming that this new force that might suddenly introduce itself into the elections is credible enough and has enough integrity to be able to stand up for the rights of Armenian citizens. Because the poll, the IRI poll that talks about number of seats, percentage of votes, also talks about women in Armenia, also talks about corruption in Armenia, and also says that Armenians in general are seeking post the war stability and reform. So I think it's pretty much an open question at this stage what the results would be, assuming that the elections take place on the 20th of June. But for me, a good indicator is that those elections will indeed take place, because I found it rather, I don't know whether to call it surreal or abnormal, that a government that has witnessed such a bad defeat in the war for whatever reasons still clings on to power and does not seek to refresh its own mandate. So that's good news. Now, that's one thing I just wanted to refer you to. The other thing I wanted to refer you today is actually not something of my own doing, but I happened to stumble on an interview, quite a long interview. It's longer than an hour actually, conducted by a woman I hadn't heard of, a program I hadn't heard of, Sona Oganesyan, who has this brand called HyeBrand, Hye as in Hye, who had an interview with the political analyst and CivilNet commentator Eric Hacopian. My viewers are aware of Eric Hacopian because I often put links in the description box that refer to his insights and his analyses. And in this interview that is well over an hour long, Eric Hacopian mentioned quite a few things. Now, I'm not going to go into a discussion now on those points. I'm not going to sort of have the role of the discussant after the presentation, but I'm going to highlight a few points which I think are key for Armenians to take into consideration if we collectively want to move forward and overcome what was a bitter loss and quite a stinging defeat only a few months ago. The first thing, well, not the first thing, but one of the things that Eric Hacopian mentioned was that no matter what we say about the travails of Armenia, the difficulties and burdens of Armenia, the unhappy realities of Armenia, it is a fact that Armenians live in far more free society than many of the neighbors in that conflict-ridden neighborhood. He made a very good point to remind viewers and listeners that the war result could have easily been translated into a military putsch, a military takeover, or the institution of a totalitarian system. None of that happened. Armenians managed, despite the pain, to move forward and do a lot of soul searching, a lot of constitutional questions being asked, a lot of questions about the behavior and the performance of the government, as well as all the other so-called opposition parties. But they have managed to keep that sense of democracy and openness alive, something which I also have referred to when I've said that despite everything else, Armenians do have the democracy gene somehow embedded into the system. So that sense of freedom, that sense of openness versus the kind of totalitarian systems that are prevalent in many parts of the world, not only in that region, is a big, big plus sign for Armenia. Eric Hacopian also mentioned the idea, and I thought it was a beautiful soundbite which could almost go into a tabloid news item. Geography is not an excuse for tyranny. And that also merges well with what I just said, that the fact that Armenia happens to be in a problematic, conflict-ridden region of the world does not mean that its political system should be tyrannical, but that it should be open, it should be free, so that gradually the reforms that are necessary will kick in and the country will be able not so much to rely on where it is today, but to reform itself and to utilize, to invest in its resources. IT comes to mind as a hub for the region, to invest in its resources for the sake of the future. And when I talk about this, this also comes close to something else that Eric Hacopian mentioned, and that is the sense that it is time for Armenians after all these years to shift gears, in the sense that they should now think more of resurrections than of crucifixions. And the way he put it again was quite a nice soundbite. He said something, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, I think: resurrections are miracles, crucifixions are not. In other words, Armenians should now really shift gears, change their mentality, no longer think in terms of crucifixions, in terms of the genocide, real as it was, painful as it was, historical as it was, something that has marked a whole country across many generations. But it is time for Armenians also to shift gears in order to look forward, not only on the sacrifices they've made during World War I and onward, but to start thinking, okay, Armenia says always, reminds interlocutors that it's a Christian country. The first lesson that could be drawn from the Christian faith is that the crucifixion led to the resurrection, which itself was the salvation of humankind. If we apply this to Armenia, then I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I am a product of the genocide. My grandparents and ancestors were living in Anatolia, so I'm not in any ways demeaning or rubbishing the significance and the weight of the sacrifices by Armenians across decades and centuries. However, I also think that it is time, particularly when we were reminded of it by this latest bitter defeat in the war, that it is time to move forward. And moving forward also means moving tracks. It doesn't mean going on the same rail, in the same tunnel, but moving to different rails, diverting a bit, and trying to build on something more positive rather than harp on what is negative. And of course, this cannot be done. Armenia is not strong enough institutionally. In fact, the institutions are quite weak. So Armenia cannot just say, oh, okay, tomorrow we're going to ditch the past and move forward. God, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it should start looking forward and trying to decide how to carve a niche for itself in the region, which would not only give it reason for prosperity and for happiness in some sense, for some peace of mind in some sense, but also as a reason why other countries, important countries in the world, the G7, the G20, United States, the European Union, some important Arab countries, why they would wish to take notice of Armenia, because Armenia is contributing something. Armenia is not only depicting itself in those grainy pictures of the horrible sacrifices and deaths and deportations that happened during the genocide and various other ethnocides, but that it is now also doing something for the 20th century and not only for what happened to it in the 20th century. And for that to happen in a country that is very young and quite weak is also to introduce into the country a sense of accountability. And it is this accountability that makes it important for the elections to succeed on the 20th of June, because this accountability to the people, to the 3+ million people still living in the Republic of Armenia, that they have a say. And with that say, with that accountability comes also responsibility. They're the flip sides of the same coin. And these are the things that I think should be kept in the minds of all Armenians. And here is where I conclude on this note by saying that Armenians should also understand that there is a difference between those Armenians living in the Republic and those Armenians who are in the diaspora. Now, usually the diaspora is more romantic, more historical in its notion, more attaches itself to old traditions and old ideas. Why? Because it is a way of preserving its Armenian identity. Whereas the Armenians in Armenia are people who are dealing daily with bread and butter issues. And therefore their priorities, their way of looking at their present and future stakes might well be different. And this is something that the diaspora, us, me, should respect. Why? Because these are the people who are living there, who are making the decisions every day and who feel the impact of those decisions on their lives and livelihoods. For us in the diaspora, it's a notion. For them in the Republic, it's a reality. And therefore, this is where I think that the diaspora and the Republic should communicate better and should form a sense of osmosis in terms of how they communicate about the future of the Republic post the perils of the war that has just been fought. And there again, I think the snap elections are also important because Armenians in the Republic itself, if I distance the diaspora a bit from the whole story now, have also been mudslinging and accusing each other of all manner of things, accusing one of treachery, the other of dirty work, oligarchy, money, military. International organizations have been attacked for misbehaving or for doing things which are inimical with the interests of the Republic. All sorts of things that have been thrown, bandied about irresponsibly and without accountability, right, left, and center. This also has to stop. But this is not going to stop by having the ordinary Armenian man or woman suddenly say, okay, I'm going to muzzle myself, I'm going to stop talking. It depends on the political responsibility and leadership of the politicians who are in the country. They should be the ones not only to show, to set an example, but also to ensure that those ideas, those democratic rights, those human rights, those fundamental freedoms are preserved for the betterment and the good of all the country. I'm going to stop here. I don't want to say much more today. I'll come back and follow some of what I threw into my few minutes today in a future episode as well. But going back, elections are important. Let's hope not only that they will be open and monitored elections, but that they would be fair and free, that they would lead to a political configuration in parliament that would actually enhance the benefits for the country and its population. And secondly, I will put in the description box one link, the link for this long interview that I just talked about at some length with you, where I picked up a few sound bites, as it were, or a few thoughts by Eric Hacopian. I think when you have an hour plus, an hour and 15 minutes, do make an effort to watch it. I think it was good because it was savvy, it was forward-looking, and I think it was a very switched-on interview. So I leave you with that, and I hope to see you again sometime in the next week or so to continue this discussion and perhaps bring the international into the conversation with the national and the domestic. Take care and all the best.